All right, so welcome in everyone to another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today we are tackling the big one.
Yeah, this is the one we've all been waiting for, I think.
I think so. Yeah, it's a lot to cover.
It is.
We're talking about the final JFK files.
That's right. Yeah.
It is March 17th, 2025.
Wow.
And 62 years after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy on November 22nd, 1963, over 1,100 PDF documents totaling over 63,000 pages
63,000 pages.
were released by the National Archives as directed.
It's crazy.
Crazy stuff.
It really is a landmark release, isn't it?
Yeah.
When you think back to that 1992 JFK Assassination Records Collection Act,
Right.
the goal was to have all of this unsealed by 2017.
Yeah.
And here we are in 2025.
Years later,
Years
finally seeing what's supposed to be the complete picture.
Yeah.
So the big question for everyone out there listening is,
Yeah.
what new angles on this enduring historical puzzle might these documents reveal for you?
And that's going to be the hard part, isn't it?
This is going to be the hard part.
I mean, we're looking at a huge amount of information, and I don't think anybody's been able to look at all 63,000 pages yet.
That's a lot.
It's just old reports and letters, handwritten memos.
Yeah, and not even
Nice.
always neatly organized or even easy to read.
No.
So how are we going to separate the genuinely groundbreaking from the already known within this massive trove of material?
Right. And the scope of these documents isn't just November 1963.
No.
It extends, years before, years after, and it covers decades worth of stuff.
Yeah.
We're talking about the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. We're talking about the communist situation in Cuba, the broader context of JFK's presidency, the reaction to the assassination of both Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr., internal planning for reorganizing the Central Intelligence Agency.
I mean,
it is a huge amount of material.
It gives you a great
panoramic
view of the time.
Yeah.
So for today, we're going to try to zero in on the core questions that have persisted in the public consciousness, especially around Lee Harvey Oswald's role, the theories of a wider conspiracy.
Yeah.
The real mission today is to try to explore what these newly released files might illuminate for your understanding of these mysteries.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's jump right into a question that's been asked countless times. Was Lee Harvey Oswald a KGB agent?
Yes.
Yeah.
This has been the biggest question, I think, out there since the assassination happened.
Yeah.
Given the Cold War climate.
Yeah.
You can understand how that would be the main theory.
Right.
So there are some interesting details in these files.
Okay.
For example, there's a letter from 1982 from David Blee, who worked in the CIA's Soviet division.
Okay.
And he writes about Oswald approaching the Soviet embassy in Mexico City, either in September or October of 1963, seeking a visa to return to the USSR.
Okay.
And this request was handled by a consular officer named Kosakov. And Blee assesses that there's no indication of any relationship between Oswald and this Kosakov beyond this visa inquiry.
But I thought this Kosakov guy was a suspected KGB officer.
It was actually described as...
memorably.
Yes, very memorably.
The most effective and dangerous of intelligence officers in Mexico. And that he was without morals, education, and manners.
Yeah.
That's quite a statement.
It really is. It gives you an idea of the kind of individual that Oswald might have been dealing with.
Yeah, it does.
But we have to look at that against other information that's been released.
Of course.
So in 1993, there's a memo that details this KGB official named Nikonov, who reviewed 5 thick volumes of files, all on Oswald. And his conclusion, after this pretty extensive review, was that Oswald was at no time an agent controlled by the KGB.
Wow. So the KGB actually came out and said that he wasn't their guy?
They said he wasn't their guy, and they actually said a couple other interesting things, too.
Okay.
While they did keep tabs on Oswald during his time in the Soviet Union, he was actually really difficult to manage.
Really?
Yeah. He had a very turbulent relationship with his Soviet wife. And this is pretty interesting. He was actually considered a very poor shot.
Really?
During his firearms practice while he was in the USSR.
A poor shot? So how is this guy supposed to have made...
You would think.
These really difficult shots?
That he was either lying or it didn't happen.
Right. So maybe it was just all made up.
It just adds fuel to those conspiracy theories, doesn't it?
It does, because if they're saying that he wasn't a good shot and he wasn't their agent, how are we supposed to believe what we've been told?
Right.
Now, there is also a 416-page CIA study in these files from February 1966. The year is redacted, unfortunately.
Okay.
It's titled The Examination of the Bona Fides of a KGB Defector by Yuri Nosenko.
Interesting.
And
What does that have to do with Oswald?
It discusses Yuri Nosenko's interactions with Oswald during Oswald's initial defection to the Soviet Union in 1959-60.
Okay.
And again, briefly in 1963. And it highlights that the KGB actually found Oswald to be of little to no intelligence value.
Wow.
And that they should not have allowed him to stay in the Soviet Union in the first place.
So they didn't even want him.
They didn't even want him.
They didn't see him as an asset.
Yeah.
They thought he was useless.
Yeah.
And they probably should have sent him back.
So again, that just lends credence to the theories that maybe this guy was not who
maybe he was a patsy.
they said he was.
Yeah.
Now, there's also a 1978 routing sheet in these files concerning a claim made by a Sergei Zorro.
Okay, I haven't heard of it.
Who claims that he provided information about Oswald to the American vice consul in Sofia, Bulgaria in August of 1963.
3 months.
Just 3 months.
Before the assassination.
Before the assassination.
Wow.
Now, in what appears to be a handwritten letter from Zorro, he alleges that he was given a warning in London and was subsequently informed by a Soviet embassy official and the Russian consul's girlfriend in Sofia that Oswald was an assassin planning to kill President Kennedy.
Wow, so he's saying that he knew.
He's saying he knew
3 months beforehand.
3 months beforehand.
That Oswald was going to kill Kennedy.
Yeah.
That's huge.
So what does he do with this information?
Well, according to him, he informed Vice Consul Blacksher, who allegedly responded that it seemed that Oswald would kill someone.
Someone?
Yeah, just someone.
But he told him Kennedy.
Well, he claims that he specifically said Kennedy was the target.
Right.
And that Blacksher said he would send a telegram to the State Department.
Okay.
Zorro then went to the State Department in Washington, D.C. himself.
He went himself?
Yeah, he went himself.
Wow.
And spoke to a director named Mr. Kippan, who downplayed the information. And with this, FBI agents used anesthesia gas on him.
What? Anesthesia gas?
Yeah, anesthesia gas.
That's insane.
It's crazy, isn't it?
That's crazy.
But this Zorro guy also makes some other claims that are a little bit unbelievable. For instance, he said that Oswald would be killed after Kennedy, and he actually named James Earl Ray as the assassin of Martin Luther King Jr.
Okay.
Which we know couldn't be accurate since Ray was already incarcerated at that time.
Yeah. So, I mean,
some of this stuff is a little bit out.
Some of his story doesn't make sense.
Right. And then we also have a memo dated January 29th, 1964, referring to a newspaper column that suggests Abram Chase, a State Department legal officer, and Llewellyn Thompson, the U.S. ambassador to Russia at the time, were responsible for Oswald's return to the United States in June of 1962.
Okay.
A council member at the American Embassy in Moscow, Samuel Wise, was also mentioned as being involved in handling Oswald's case.
So this is even more evidence that they were aware of this guy.
They were aware
before the assassination.
They knew about him.
They knew about him. And maybe they were even
involved
in getting him back to the U.S.
Yeah, why would they do that?
Okay, so we've talked about what the Soviets thought about Oswald.
Yes.
Now let's look at what the FBI and CIA knew about him prior to November 1963.
Yeah, let's do that.
So the 1964 Warren Commission testimony of Alan H. Belmont, the assistant FBI director, details the FBI's interviews with Oswald concerning Soviet recruitment attempts.
Right.
And Belmont recounts an agent's impression in July 1961 that Oswald had learned his lesson in the USSR and had a newfound appreciation for the American way of life.
Wow. So they thought he was reformed.
They thought he was reformed. They thought he had seen the light.
Yeah, interesting.
But of course, as we know, he wasn't really reformed.
No, not really.
So did the FBI.
Did they ever say that he was an informant?
Consider him an informant at any point?
Or an asset.
What, was he on their payroll?
Belmont made a firm assertion that Oswald was never an informant of the FBI.
Okay.
And J. Edgar Hoover himself confirmed in a letter dated February 6, 1964, that he was never an informant of the FBI.
So there's a paper trail, at least, saying that he wasn't.
He wasn't. But what about the fact that he returned to the U.S. from the Soviet Union?
Yeah.
I mean, that's
unusual for that time period.
Right. So how did the intelligence community not see that as suspicious?
Well, David Slauson, a staff member on the Warren Commission, actually investigated this.
Okay.
And he initially concluded that it wasn't really that suspicious because after Stalin died, the Soviet Union's immigration policies relaxed a bit.
Okay.
And this is actually stated in a letter from July 3rd, 1964, from J. Lee Rankin, the Warren Commission's general counsel, to Richard Helms at the CIA.
Okay, so it sounds like they really wanted to believe that this guy...
They didn't want to believe that he was a threat.
Right.
They were willing to kind of overlook
Right.
some of these things, but these 2025 files actually show.
What do they show? That Oswald was placed on a CIA watch list for mail interception.
Oh, wow.
As early as November 1959, right after he defected.
So they were intercepting his mail.
They were looking at his mail for years. They did this.
From when to when?
From 1959 to 1962.
So this shows that they weren't just passively unaware of Oswald.
No, they were. They had an active interest in him.
Monitoring him.
Yeah.
And what does the CIA say about all this?
Well, in these new records, they reiterate that they never engaged or used Oswald as an agent or asset.
Okay.
They haven't found any evidence to support these theories that he was working for them.
But if you're intercepting someone's mail for that long,
you're
interested in him.
Have some interest in them.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about Gary Underhill.
All right, Gary Underhill.
This former CIA employee,
right.
A memo dated July 19th, 1967, details claims that Underhill made to friends the day after President Kennedy was killed.
And he reportedly told his friends that a small clique within the CIA was responsible for Kennedy's death.
Wow.
He was also afraid for his own safety.
He thought they might come after him.
Yeah. And tragically, Gary Underhill was found dead less than 6 months later.
Oh, no.
And although the official ruling was suicide, his friends strongly doubted that conclusion.
Yeah, that surprised me.
So what did his friends say about why he was killed?
His friends said that Underhill believed that the assassination was carried out by a group within the CIA.
Within the CIA?
Yeah.
Wow.
Involved in illegal activities like gun running, narcotics trafficking, and political manipulation.
Okay, so they were dirty.
They were dirty.
Yeah. But what happened to this group?
He thought that Kennedy was killed to stop him from exposing them.
So he was going to blow the whistle.
That's what he thought.
So they silenced him.
That's what he thought, yeah.
But it's also really strange how he died.
Yeah. It was strange. He was found with a gunshot behind his left ear.
Okay.
Despite being right-handed.
Right.
And the pistol was found under his left side.
Okay.
And nobody in the apartment building heard a gunshot.
So how do you...
It's suspicious, isn't it?
Explain that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it seems like there's a lot more to this.
A lot more
than we've been told.
That meets the eye, yeah.
Now let's talk about Cuba.
Okay.
What do these new files tell us about Fidel Castro's reaction to JFK's death and the operations that the U.S. was carrying out against Cuba at the time?
So this is interesting. And they thought that maybe they could work with him.
Yeah.
Castro even directed the Cuban government to not criticize President Johnson publicly.
Oh, wow.
And that they should wait and see on improving relations with the new administration.
Wow.
So they were actually hoping to maybe build bridges with the U.S.
That's really interesting.
After Kennedy died.
Yeah. But of course, the United States was conducting all kinds of covert operations.
Yeah, they were up to no good in Cuba.
Against Castro's government.
Yeah.
During this time, right?
Right.
So what do these files reveal about that?
Well, they detail a lot of U.S. efforts aimed at destabilizing the Cuban government.
Like what?
Well, for example, a memo from July 27th, 1963.
Okay.
Discusses a request for explosives.
Explosives?
And it outlines a plan to sabotage the Havana power plant.
Wow, so they were actively trying to sabotage the Cuban government.
Absolutely. And there's another secret memo from July 20th, 1962.
Okay.
About an expected ship carrying arms and ammunition and a yacht.
What was the yacht for?
Intended for activities directed against Castro.
So they were going to attack by sea?
They were, yeah.
Wow.
And even earlier in August 1959, there's a report that quotes Alberto Fernandez Hera.
Who is that?
He was the head of the Cuban Sugar Board.
Okay.
And he describes Castro as a ruthless and determined leader.
So they knew that he wasn't going to be easy to get rid of.
He wasn't going to give up.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, the Wall Street Journal news also pointed out the CIA's lack of transparency regarding these Cuba operations.
They weren't forthcoming with information.
And this is particularly relevant because of Castro's threats of retaliation against U.S. leaders.
Yes.
So what else is in these files about that?
Well, the files actually mention that the CIA station chief in Mexico asked the Mexican president to pass a message to President Eisenhower in 1960.
Wow, so they were using
Back channels.
back channels to
Yeah.
communicate with each other.
Yeah.
And there were also discussions
Into
from the CIA about the fallout of declassifying documents
Right.
related to their espionage activities in India.
Oh, wow.
So it seems like they were really worried about
They were
what would happen
Yeah.
if people found out.
Yeah, they didn't want people to know what they were up to.
What they were doing. Now, what about the long-rumored cooperation
Right.
between the CIA and organized crime
Yeah.
in those anti-Castro efforts? Do these files say anything about that?
Well, they actually confirm that there was collaboration,
Oh, wow.
but they don't directly link it to JFK's assassination.
Okay.
So a partially redacted report from 1975
Okay.
details the CIA plan to recruit mafia figures like Sam Giancana,
Giancana.
who was offered $150,000 to kill Fidel Castro.
Wow.
And the ideas they came up with
What?
were a little bit crazy. They talked about an exploding seashell.
An exploding seashell.
And they even talked about using lethal bacteria.
Wow.
These plans, though, were eventually aborted.
So exploding seashells, that sounds like a
Sounds like a James Bond movie.
James Bond movie.
Yeah.
Now, what about these files
Yeah.
and what they say about the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr.?
Okay, so there's an interesting memo about this guy named Roderick Claflin Brown,
Okay.
a Panamanian national.
Okay.
And he voluntarily went to the FBI in Panama in April 1968.
Okay, just after King was killed.
Yeah, shortly after King was assassinated.
Okay.
And he talked about meeting a guy named Marvin P. Luttrell at an airport in October 1962.
Okay, and who is Luttrell?
He owned a motor company in Alabama.
Okay.
And during this encounter,
Yeah.
Luttrell asked Brown if he knew Dr. King.
Okay.
And he called King our greatest problem.
Or greatest problem.
Yeah, and he offered Brown unspecified employment.
Unspecified employment. What do
Yeah.
you think that was all about?
Well, Brown thought that maybe this job offer was related to plans to harm Dr. King.
To harm Dr. King.
Yeah, but he didn't really think much of it until King was assassinated.
That's so creepy.
It is creepy, isn't it?
Okay, so let's get into the FBI's mishandling
All right.
of evidence or information that
Yeah.
these files may reveal.
Yeah.
So the FBI actually found about 2,400 previously unrecognized JFK-related records
Wow.
in their own files.
Wow. So they lost track of 2,400 documents.
Yeah,
That's a lot of documents.
it's a lot of files.
Yeah.
And these have been transferred to the National Archives,
Okay.
but the FBI hasn't said what's in these files.
Yeah, that's a little concerning that they wouldn't tell us
Right.
what they're about.
So what else did they mishandle?
Well, there's this transcript
Okay.
from November 22nd to 24th, 1963.
Okay.
And it records a discussion with J. Edgar Hoover about an anonymous threat that was made against Oswald
Okay.
the night before Ruby shot him. And Hoover says that the FBI actually told the Dallas police about this threat,
Oh, wow.
but they didn't do anything about it.
So they basically let Oswald
They let him die.
get killed.
Yeah.
Wow.
And Hoover also expressed a lot of concern about public perception
Yeah.
after Ruby shot Oswald.
After Ruby killed Oswald.
Yeah, so
It's
he
hard-
was worried about.
What was he concerned about?
Well, in this newly disclosed memo, he expresses concern that the public's not going to believe
Okay.
that Oswald acted alone.
So he was already thinking about conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
Wow.
So he knew right away that people were not going to believe
Yeah.
that Oswald acted alone.
So what about the evidence for a second shooter?
Yeah. A lot of people want to know about that.
Do these files provide any definitive evidence?
Well, they don't,
Okay.
unfortunately. But there is some new information that has come out.
Okay.
For instance, the FBI admitted in 1978 that they couldn't find the original fingerprints
The fingerprints from the rifle.
lifted from the rifle that Oswald allegedly used.
So they lost the fingerprints.
They lost the fingerprints.
Yeah.
The Dallas police gave them the fingerprints back in 1963,
Okay.
but the FBI says they can't find them.
Wow. So they're just gone.
They're gone.
So we're talking about really important
Yeah, a really important piece of evidence.
forensic evidence that's just disappeared.
Disappeared.
So let's go back to Oswald's time in Mexico City.
Okay.
What else do these files say about the CIA's operations there?
So there's this cable from October 10th, 1963,
Okay.
that talks about Oswald's meetings at the Soviet embassy in Mexico City.
Okay.
And this information comes from what they're calling a reliable and sensitive source, who they identified as a high-level Mexican intelligence asset involved in surveillance.
Okay.
So they're saying that this guy was spying on Oswald
Yeah.
in Mexico City.
So they knew that he was there.
They knew.
And they knew that he was meeting with the Soviets.
They knew. And this was just weeks before the assassination.
So why wasn't this information shared?
That's the question, isn't it?
That's more effectively with the rest of the U.S. intelligence community.
Yeah, why didn't they connect the dots?
Right.
It also shows that U.S. and Mexican intelligence agencies were working together really closely on this.
Yeah.
The Mexican security services were giving the CIA information about Oswald's contacts.
So why didn't they do something with this information?
Right.
Now let's talk about George Joannides.
Right. George Joannides.
Who was this guy?
So he was a CIA officer.
Okay.
And in 1963, he was running a covert CIA program that was funding the anti-Castro Cuban Student Directorate.
So they were training Cuban exiles.
They were training Cuban exiles.
To overthrow Castro.
Yes.
And what do these new files tell us about Joannides and his program?
Well, they revealed that members of the DRE, Cuban Student Directorate, actually had face-to-face encounters with Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans just months before the assassination. They were debating him publicly.
Really?
And they were publicizing his pro-Castro activities.
Wow.
This is an organization that was funded by the CIA.
So the CIA was funding a group that was interacting with Oswald before he killed Kennedy?
And the crazy thing is...
And they didn't tell anyone.
This was never disclosed to the Warren Commission or the House Select Committee on Assassinations.
So they were actively hiding this
information.
Yeah.
Wow.
And while there's no evidence that Joannides or the DRE knew about Oswald's plan to assassinate Kennedy.
The fact that they were connected to him...
It makes you wonder, doesn't it?
It makes you wonder.
Yeah.
So what do these files reveal about how the Soviet Union and Cuba reacted to Kennedy's death?
Okay, so an FBI memo says that communist officials in the USSR were deeply upset when they learned about Kennedy's assassination.
Really?
Yeah, they were...
Why would they be upset?
They thought it was a far-right conspiracy in the U.S.
A far-right conspiracy?
Yeah.